Unexpected Journey, Memoir of a Siberian Deportee by Juzė Avižienytė-Žukauskiene. Translated from Lithuanian and narrated by Giedrė Kumpikas, niece of the author, and by Isabelle Kumpikas, the sister of the author. Chapter 48. We Change Our Workplace. In my new workplace, I definitively decided not to accept any higher positions than might be offered to me, but rather to remain a simple average worker. It was better to lug sacks of grain than to become involved in the swindles and intrigues of the administrators. Besides that, the rumors were heard that the Soviets had withstood the Germans at Stalingrad, that they were getting a large supply of weapons from somewhere else, that French pilots who had left their occupied country were fighting above Stalingrad, that the Germans had been beaten in the plain of Kursk. If we had not been receiving any news before, now, in Parbig, there was a radio loudspeaker attached high on a pole over which reports from the Information Bureau about the victories of the Soviet army were constantly broadcast. Endlessly, the voice of director Zevitan could be heard, and he always ended his announcements with the slogan, Smert fascistam, death to the fascists. But the war brought death not only to fascists. Local women would get more and more frequently pocheronie, that is, death announcements about the loss of their husbands, brothers, sons. And so not much joy from the news about the victories of the Soviet army. Our clothing was completely worn. After our sale in Komarovka, we were left with only what we were wearing. We were receiving some pay for our work, but there was nothing to buy anywhere. In the store, everyone, not only deportees, was able to redeem the bread ration and once a month, 400 grams of salt per person. The local old-timers covered themselves with what they had managed to exchange from the deportees for potatoes, milk, and vegetables, and always grumbled that the clothing was not durable. Besides these clothes, most of them had furs, mostly from dog fur, and hard felt boots. The less wealthy were satisfied with kufaikas, cotton felt jackets. Since the beginning of 1942, we had only obtained one pair of pimi for our whole family. The father and son, Ludas, worked in the warmth of the Fold wool factory. All they had to do was to run to the workplace and back. Stasukas and I worked in a cold warehouse. He would sometimes even have to drive some 15 kilometers into the taiga for hay and wood. And so he would most often wear those felt boots. We became very weak. My legs began to swell again. My teeth became loose due to scurvy. Once again, festering sores began to appear on my legs. Worst of all, I had nothing with which to bandage them. I tore up handkerchiefs because they were unsellable, unexchangeable valuables. I used to cut a small strip from my underwear. I used to rinse the used rags and would glue them back on my sores. We lived in a common barracks with seasonal workers who had been sent from the collective farm. I was embarrassed to dress my legs more often. I did not want others to be repulsed and, of course, grumble. I should go to the hospital, but it was still very cold, minus 35 degrees Celsius, and to wade through the snow for 8 kilometers. I did not trust my aching legs. It was impossible not to go to work, because without a certificate from the hospital excusing me from work, I wouldn't even get those grams of bread, with which I more or less sustained my life. One time Stasukas, having returned from transporting hay, brought back a piece of tarpaulin. He ran to the forest guard, borrowed a small hatchet, and fashioned out wooden soles. Having found a piece of twisted wire, he broke off small hooks and nailed together some wooden clogs. What joy and triumph! Everyone was looking, touching them, and praising him for his ingenuity. What a strong sole! It doesn't get wet through. It is not like bast sandals. As one who could not walk, I was assigned to mend sacks. I felt happy. I was sitting and it was warm. Besides, I would be able to manage a piece of thread or a patch. Our clothing was full of holes, and one couldn't get any patches or thread anywhere. There was nothing in the store, and to use flax was forbidden. On the other hand, working in the warehouse, we could chew on grain, of course, if Ivanicha, the warehouse woman, or her assistant were not nearby. One time we were working in the oat section, and they were not very edible. We would chew them, suck on them, and spit them out. But here, the 10-year-old son of a guard, climbing about on the partitions in one high bin, tightly nailed down to the floor, noticed some peas. He soon announced this happy news to us. One young worker immediately organized a grabbing. Looking around if Ivanicha was not nearby, we stood watch. And Marusia, so that worker was called, and Vitya, the pea finder, crept up to the second floor by the pea bin. They were below on the first floor, but from the beam it was possible to jump into the bin. The child jumped from the beam into the bin, filled his pockets and cap with peas, while Marusia, untying her scarf from her head, holding on to one corner herself, gave the second one to the grabber. He, holding on to the partition, and the pulled scarf slipped back down again. Immediately we all ran together to share our loot. Each one of us got a handful, but, oh horrors, from our joy we forgot about the guards. We all put the peas into our mouths and chewed, but suddenly someone whispered frighteningly, "Ivanicha." We all shoved the peas where we could think of. I had no pocket, so I pushed a handful into a pile of oats and with a breaking heart poured out my luck. Marusia slipped her handful in the scarf into the breast pocket of her overalls. The little pocket was small and bulged out. It was especially noticeable since she was rather full-breasted. The child put the cap with the rest of the peas on his head. And here the little peas began to plop, plop past his ears. He pressed the little cap on his head and shot through the door. We probably were quite nervous, and Ivanicha noticed this. "What is this? What are you up to?" "Don't you see we are scooping grain into sacks?" one of the women answered insolently. She looked us over with angry eyes. I was hurriedly scooping grain from that spot where I had poured the peas into a sack, which was being held. Who would find a couple of grams of peas in such a sack? Ivanicha was perceptive. She immediately went up to Marusia, touched the little pocket. "No, I pashal grom po peklu." It began to thunder in hell. She called the assistant right away. The search began. Of course, they did not find anything on anyone, but they dragged Marusia off to the office. They weighed the grabbed peas. It appeared there were even 30 grams. At once, they reported it to the militia. Marusia was summoned to the regional center, where she spent 10 days in the guardhouse. They cursed her out, threatened her, and let her go. Yes, to touch government-owned grain, especially one grain, or to touch another thing was a terrible crime. Why did Ivanicha cause such an uproar? For 30 grams of peas? It was clear. She, the director, and the assistant had scooped up not only 30 grams. For the shortage, there might be some noise. And here was a documented grabbing. We are clean, we are watchful, the workers are stealing. But hunger is a great motivator. Despite big punishments, very few did not give in to temptation to pour a handful or two under the bosom or into a pants pocket, since it was too dangerous to pour into a pocket. It would be discovered too easily in a search. One time it happened that my son Ludas had to work with a horse to whom had been allotted 2 kilograms of oats. Having poured out the oats for the horse, he could not resist the temptation. He swallowed a couple of handsful. Being half-starved, instead of chewing them and sucking on them and then spitting them out, as the warehouse workers used to do, he swallowed the oats with their shells. Acute intestinal pains began. He managed to get home somehow. He was writhing, groaning, screaming, and turning black. Once I determined the cause, I ran as quickly as I could to those children whose house the station had taken. I begged them for several potatoes. I grated them and poured boiling water over them. It turned into a watery, viscous paste. Liudvikas drank about a couple of liters. That caused rumbling sounds in his intestines, and finally it forced the elimination. His intestines were apparently injured because not only the oat shells were coming out, but also a substantial amount of blood. It was terrifying to tell anyone about it, even if that person did not want to cause any harm, but would laugh about it to someone else, and he to a third party. The rumor would go where it shouldn't. To turn to the hospital was also frightening. The hospital would give a certificate that he ate oats destined for a government horse. Oh, what a life! Living in Lithuania, even during the war, I never imagined that a human being could endure so much. The greatest dream, bread, to eat one's fill just once. Our clothing and shoes were completely worn out. What would happen next? For 1 month's wages, we could get a pail of potatoes. Even this was not so easy to find. Who had them for sale or who would agree to sell them? Clothing, not even clothing, patches or a piece of thread was anywhere to be had. But we were still clinging to life. We were still not losing hope that someday we would be free. For in our temporary certificates, it was written that we were deported for 5 years. We had endured already 3.5 years. 1.5 years remained.